To me to give the presentation today. I'm born, bred and work in Wales, and it's quite interesting that for a number of years in Wales they've looked west and they've sort of tried to emulate the Irish economic model. Given the current problems, it seems that policymakers in Wales seem to be at the loss of where to look in the future. Maybe it's a similar situation in Ireland. But unfortunately for Wales, Wales has never really had the sort of the upsurge in terms of its competitiveness and economic fortunes enjoyed by Ireland. And by UK standards, Wales remains in the doldrums economically. And it's really this unevenness in regional economic development and the links with creativity across the UK that is the focus of the presentation today. For many years, economic development in the UK has been characterised by a north-south divide, seen in the more prosperous south, particularly around London, and the greater southeast, and the less prosperous north, and Wales tends to get pushed into that, even though it's not that much in the north. I think what often gets overlooked, and what I'm going to focus on today, is maybe a growing divide between competitiveness between urban areas and more rural areas. So that's what's going to be some of the focus. In conceptual terms, my point of departure is a 2005 book, some of you may be aware of it, by the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Thomas Friedman, The World is Flat. Now, along with another book by Francis Cairncross, The Death of Distance, this has formed one of the most influential texts examining the progress of globalization, and especially the impact of information and communication technologies. And to my mind, these are at the crux of what we might call actually the smart economy. Now, according to Friedman's flat world thesis, advances in technology have leveled the global economic playing field. Friedman argues that everyone and every firm can be a global player, no matter where on earth they are located. In a flat world, you can innovate without having to emigrate, says Friedman. So has the world really become that flat? Well, to an extent, yes. But I think in reality, it's actually both flat and spiked at the same time. And the American academic Richard Florida has produced a counter-argument to Friedman, which shows that we live in a world which is as spiky as it is flat. For instance, he highlights that the increasing importance of cities as the home of ever larger numbers of the world's population. And now more than 50% of the world's people live in urban areas. And these are regardless of whether they're urban areas in more advanced or less developed economies. And the knock-on effect of this is that a number of key locations around the world have increasingly become centres for a significant proportion of the world's economic activity and wealth generation. Now, my own research concentrates more around the issues around knowledge and innovation and how this becomes spread across the world. And based on the generation of knowledge protected by patents, we can see that innovation is concentrated in an even smaller number of locations. And you can see maybe some of the spikes. Here, these two spikes here, and I checked them out on the map in terms of patterns, and it's actually they're Taiwan and South Korea. And you can see from the data, by 2001, both of these countries had actually surpassed the UK in terms of the number of new patents granted by the US Patent and Trade Office. If we take another measure of sort of knowledge generation, this is looking at scientific citations. And again, we can see more concentration. So as a result of advances in telecommunications and IT, which allow the instantaneous transfer of information, it would seem that regardless of location, we can access knowledge. I think this is true to an extent, but in fact, in many ways, the reverse seems to be true. We do see these concentrations. Now, of course, Florida is best known for his work on the creative class concept, whereby talent, creativity, and its geographic clustering are considered to be at the heart of economic development. And this has meant that cities and urban development are considered to be propelled by the talent pools they actually create. Cities, it is argued, offer a quality of place in terms of their openness, diversity, and overall environment that facilitates innovation and economic growth. Now, to my mind, this is all very well, but there does appear to be very little in the creative class theory to consider how growth occurs in other areas, such as rural areas, or even whether or not it should actually be encouraged in the first instance. And I think this is an issue. So who are the creative class? Well, if you look at the way that Florida splits it, we can think maybe about two types. We can think about this creative core, inventors, maybe more around science and technology development. Then we have the creative professionals, the ones who assist maybe these science and technology individuals or others involved in education, but generally high-skilled workers. And then we have the more artistic, sort of the bohemians. We've done some work we tried to replicate in the UK, the model that Florida used in the US. And we estimate about 37% of the workforce in the UK can actually be covered underneath one of these definitions. Now, my own interest, as you probably tell from the intro and the number of mentions of the term competitiveness, is actually related around this concept, and in particular, how competitiveness maybe can be measured across regions and locations. Now, there's quite a bit of research in terms of trying to measure competitiveness across nations. We have the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Report, led by Michael Porter at Harvard University, and there's a number of other tools as well. But actually, there seems to be a gap in terms of whether these indices at the regional or local level, and that's some of the work that I've been trying to do. Now, actually, by competitiveness, I'm mainly referring to the ways in which wealth is generated, and how this wealth is actually transferred into the standards of living enjoyed by citizens. And I take a definition from the economic geographer Michael Storper, who says that competitiveness is the capability of an economy to attract and maintain increasing numbers of firms within markets that are actually growing, and how this wealth that's generated through these markets is actually transferred to actually citizens. So the link between wealth generation and actually higher standards of living. And that's the way that I see it. So we can think that competitiveness is actually influenced by a number of factors. Public and private investment, obviously in things such as human capital and skills, the quality of infrastructure, be it physical or maybe softer. Obviously the productivity of the workforce in terms of output, institutional capacity, be it public and private sector, and then more softer measures such as social capital, and then the social and business networks between individual and some of the research facilities within a particular location. So in other words, competitiveness is increasingly being measured in terms of creativity, knowledge, and environmental conditions, rather than purely just accumulated wealth. And this is where I'm trying to take it in terms of some of my definitions. What we suggest is that maybe there's a link between competitiveness, knowledge, and innovation. And by knowledge, in this case, I'm referring to the stock of information and skills concerned with connecting new ideas with commercial values. So the development of new products and processes. Basically what we define as being innovation. And whereas innovation is a process, we can see knowledge as being the recipes and ingredients to actually be processed. So in this simple model, we can see that competitiveness is dependent on the innovations resulting from the creation and use of knowledge, with competitiveness referring to the conditions that enable firms to compete within their chosen markets and the capability for capturing this value within a particular region or locality. There's no point creating wealth if it gets dissipated elsewhere, maybe through FDI or maybe through other links within the global economy. So moving more particularly to the UK context, as was mentioned in the intro, I've been involved for a number of years in producing a competitive index for the UK. And we first published this in 2000. We published it basically annually, it's been a couple of years. And it was the first really benchmark that actually tried to look at regions and localities in the UK and see how they actually compare in terms of their overall competitiveness, and tries to build up a composite indicator, a single indicator based on a basket of measures. So we put together a range of different indicators, fairly simple model in terms of input and output factors. We'd like to have more. We're fairly limited in terms of some of the availability of data. So for instance, we can see there's not much in there around networks, for instance. It'd be nice to actually measure networks. Some of it's around skills, around business development, and then again measure the productivity. And then we say maybe standards of living to some extent, measured by unemployment rates and wages. These are the rankings for the 12 UK regions. These are the rankings from our last index in 2008. We haven't published one at the moment because we're trying to take into account the fact of the recession. There's a lot of, some of you may know there's a lot of lag in terms of regional data, so we're waiting for some new data to come out. But this is the ranking, and maybe if you've got knowledge of the UK, what you'd expect. 100 is the overall average, and you can see there's only 3 regions actually perform above the average, and this is basically the greater southeast, London, the southeast, and the east of England. You can see all the rest of are below average, and then you've got my own region, just above the northeast, 11th and 12th position. And you can see Northern Ireland only just above that. So if you put any credibility in terms of the methodology, you can see there is a fair gap. And if you go back to 2000 when we started, we took it back to 1997, you can see there's actually a growing divide between these regions in terms of their overall competitiveness. And if you just take a simple measure, obviously I'm interested in Wales. This is quite interesting data. This was done by Nick Crafts, who's an economic historian at Warwick Business School. And he's actually used a methodology based on earnings to track back GDP per capita to 1870 for all the UK's regions. I've just put these for London and for Wales. And you can see the recent divergence. If you look at the data, Wales actually peaked in terms of its GDP per capita relative to the UK in 1891, and has largely been on the slide since then. It now stands at 75% of the UK average, which is the lowest it's ever been. So you can see this growing divide in many ways. What I'm more interested in today is actually the difference between rural and urban areas. And as well as the 12 regions, we benchmark around the 400 local authority areas within the UK as well. So we put together an index based on these localities. And I wanted to try and split them in terms of their rural and urban characteristics. And there's a definition that comes out from the government in the UK which lists whether an area is more urban or more ruralised. And I've used this definition. You can see there's about, 6 or 7 categories. And what I've basically done is group them into 2. So just taking the urban and the rural together. And what you see overall in terms of the population breakdown is that about 1/3 of the UK can be considered rural to some extent. So it's fairly significant, and as you can see, it varies across regions, with the most ruralised regions being the southwest and eastern England. And in general, it's clear there's a fairly significant variation in the urban and rural split across particular regions. Now, as shown by this table, only those localities in the major urban areas are more competitive than the national average. And as you might expect, these are in the greater southeast, the 3 regions that I mentioned earlier. But interestingly, those localities with the significant rural parts, and with more than 50% of their population, based on that definition, in those areas, are actually more competitive than the non-major urban areas. But the overall pattern of competitiveness is changing, and we can see there is a growing divergence in terms of urban and rural competitiveness. You can look at some of the change figures. Some of the change figures here. And you can see the drop in terms of the competitiveness score of the rural areas. And between 1997 and 2008, rural areas have seen a considerable fall in their overall competitiveness compared to most of the urban communities. And this has got faster between 2005 and between 2008. It's become even more accentuated, with urban localities improving their economic competitiveness and the divide widening at the expense of their rural counterparts. Now, this growing urban-rural divide is undoubtedly related to some of the changing forces in terms of demography and in terms of migration from rural areas to the more urban areas, and in particular, the Greater South East. Closely related to these shifts is the role of economic development policy in the UK over the last 25 years, which has become increasingly biased towards regeneration and rejuvenation of the UK's largest cities and urban areas. Cities have become the key location for an increasing proportion of economic activity in the UK, with the counter side of the equation being the migration of younger workers and the economic activity they have and the capability to produce from rural areas. So this shift. So you could say, actually, maybe you do need to actually emigrate to innovate within the UK context. If we take a regional perspective on urban-rural patterns of competitiveness, this provides an interesting snapshot of differences in performance. We can see in some regions, the southwest, Scotland, northeast, eastern England and Yorkshire, urban areas outperform rural areas. But in the remainder of the regions, rural areas are more competitive in overall terms. Significantly so in the cases we can see of the northwest and the West Midlands. So this suggests in many cases rural localities are as much an asset to national competitiveness in the UK as their urban counterparts. However, implicit within regional strategy across the UK is the emphasis on urban areas as the source of competitiveness, and the idea being that hopefully their competitiveness will lead to spill over and trickle down to some of the rural areas. Now, more recently, this strategy has become even more explicit and transparent by the so-called city region approach to development that's been undertaken within the UK, with the rural hinterlands sought to become better integrated into the fabric of urban frameworks so as to capitalise upon their apparent competitive advantage. So this is trying to suggest maybe a drive towards some kind of homogeneity, trying to push rural areas to become more like their urban counterparts, and whereby the revived quality of place of urban areas is seen as a central theme of economic development. Now, if urban to rural economic spillover were occurring, there's probably two ways to see if this is actually plausible. First, you would think there'd be some kind of levelling out in terms of the competitiveness differentials between regions. Or second, you'd see an overall improvement in the UK's competitiveness within the global economy. Now, as the table shows, across all regions, rural localities are losing ground in favour of urban areas. You can see the difference. You can see where the figures drop, the minus figures for most of the rural areas compared to the urban counterparts. Now, obviously, this is a relative situation, with inevitably some localities improving at the relative expense of others. Now, as a means of trying to consider more absolute changes in competitiveness, we could suggest that the UK's positioning in some of these international competitiveness league tables I mentioned earlier would change, and that maybe if it was developing, the UK would actually improve their positions. Now, I've checked out the rankings on the two main indicators of global competitiveness. The first one is the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Report, the other being the World Competitiveness Yearbook, published by the Institute of Management Development in Switzerland. Now, on the Global Competitiveness Report, the UK ranked in 7th position in 1997. By 2008, it dropped to 12th. On the IMD list, it was ranked 12th in 1997, and then it dropped to 21st by 2008. So my conclusion is, given this drop in the international competitiveness of the UK as a whole, it can be concluded that there is an erosion in the competitiveness of rural areas. And furthermore, this erosion is actually undermining national competitiveness. Now, I haven't said much so far about the creative class. So shifting our attention to the location of the creative class across these localities. Now, this is based on location quotients. So you can see what the mean average for Great Britain is 1. Now, although major urban localities have an above proportion of creative class workers, this is largely boosted by the concentration of the bohemians, the artists, the sculptors, the musicians within London. If we remove some of these these bohemians from the index, we can see a considerably more level distribution in terms of the creative class. And if you look at the other urban areas, basically small towns and cities, and some of these localities with significant rural parts, there's quite a proportion of creative class workers in these areas. And also the proportion of creative workers is only marginally lower than the national average. So this suggests that the distribution of the stock of the creative class is more evenly spread than might be anticipated. However, the most ruralized areas do possess a significantly lower number in these occupations, the rural 80 as it was. Now, within the relatively heavy weighted agenda of both national and regional economic development towards urban policies, it would seem to me in the UK at least that the quality of place benefits of more ruralised areas appears to be overlooked. These city-region approaches and these frameworks seem to offer little to capitalise on the benefits. And this is despite, a growing rhetoric around sustainability and environmental development. And if this were to continue, there seems to be an innate inevitability in the UK that cities are where it's at. And this is where the infrastructure and support that creative workers require will be located. And this is where regional development activities will be actually focused. To me, this seems to be an oversimplification. And this table tries to show that the distribution of creative class workers within rural regions often shows a comparable or even greater proportion of creative class workers within rural areas. Therefore, differences that show up at an aggregated national level are not mirrored across individual regions. And we can see some of these differences, in particular you can see in the case of the North West and West Midlands, where there's actually more creative class workers within the rural economy than there is within the urban economy. And that's despite having Birmingham within the West Midlands, for instance, which is seen as having quite a lot of creative workers. And furthermore, although the proportion of artistic workers, as we said, were in London, we can see that in some of the other regions we can see, I think within Wales and the southwest, you can actually see some of these, the proportion of bohemian creative class is actually higher in the rural economies than it is within the urban economies. So to me it seems that these sculptures, these artists are often located in areas of natural beauty within these regions. And they could be important tourist spots. I don't think that's been developed as much as possibly as it has in Ireland. The integration potential between the commercial development of arts-related activity and rural tourism in the UK is still relatively limited. And it certainly falls short of the strong connection that cities have been made in using arts and cultural activities as their key tourist levers. And in general, the linking of cultural tourism as a feature of rural placemaking is still relatively underdeveloped in the UK. And I think there's more scope to develop these markets and to take a more entrepreneurial approach. Particularly among many of these bohemians, they're going to be within the relatively younger age bands. So, to conclude, we can see that the world is flattening, but it's still incredibly spiky. We can see there's local and regional peaks and valleys, and this illustrates, within the UK context at least, that the world is still far from a level playing field. And in particular, there is a growing competitiveness divide between rural and urban areas. We can see that creativity within the UK is clearly just not an urban phenomenon. And a key finding of our research, we think, is the fact that we find that the creative class is more evenly distributed than is sometimes considered. And maybe pushed by people like Florida who've come to the UK to do some work, and the focus has been just on cities. So what we conclude in our research is the fact that we need to ensure there's a fair playing field and access to opportunity across the UK as a whole. Now, the government doesn't seem to see it this way. If you look at some of the policies coming out from national government, the government suggests that rural policy supporting business growth has to be realistic and account for the potential that some of the rural population may actually trade off lifestyle benefits against for productive employment or other economic growth. Now, maybe there's some truth in this analysis, But in many ways, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy if there is little opportunity to access or to create such opportunity, employment, and business. Now, at present, within the UK, the tools for promoting competitiveness through creativity are either urban biased or just generic in the first instance. They don't actually account for any particular demographic, cultural, or societal differences across particular regions. So my argument, and I probably would say this as a researcher, is perhaps we need more research and to get a more refined understanding of the socio-economic structure and infrastructure underlying the creative class, the creative workers, and the types of people actually undertaking it in the first instance. So even though maybe the agenda seems moving away, shifting away from Florida, I think in some ways we're at the beginnings. And to actually explore outside of cities the development and the focus of the future and the links between creativity and the links between competitiveness can tell us a lot about maybe how we can move at some point in time towards economic growth again. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.